Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mikowski. Thanks for being with us. And joining me today from the coast of North Carolina is Angie Zombeck. Dr. Angie Zombeck, how are you today?
Good. How about yourself?
I'm doing well, thank you. Now, Angie and I have traveled in similar circles for a long time, but I just finally had the chance to meet her in person a few weeks ago. And I was like, Angie, I've got to get you on the podcast. So thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Oh, delighted. So it's Women's History Month, and one of the things I like to do is to bring women historians on for Women's History Month to serve as examples for folks. I was the father of a young daughter who's now 30, and as she grew up, I wanted her to be able to see role models. And so that's kind of what got me started many, many years ago doing this. And you had a fantastic, phenomenal career, and it seems like you're living life in its extreme fullness right now. So tell us a little bit about what you're doing down at UNC Wilmington.
Well, I specialize in the Civil War era, so I teach classes on the Civil War and Reconstruction, the Old South, the Antebellum North. I also teach a class on imprisonment in the United States, which stems from my first book project, which was called Penitentiaries, Punishment in Military Prisons. And then totally outside of the Civil War era, I also teach a class called Rock and Roll in American Society, since I grew up in Cleveland and the place to go on field trips when I was going through school was the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So I look at how rock and roll reflects different impulses in American society, politics. It's a great class.
It is really cool. I mean, you think about that parallel form of the arc of history and the arc of rock and roll, and rock and roll is always a reaction to what's going on in current events in a lot of ways. So that's going to be a really neat class that's grounded in your discipline.
It is, yeah. And actually, my interest in music is broad. So even when I teach the Civil War, I still introduce Civil War era songs to the students so that they can kind of see like what was pop culture like in the 19th century during this massive war.
Yeah. So now, when you said that you grew up around Cleveland, and your face actually lit up, and a lot of people from Cleveland don't light up like that. So.
Yes. Yep, I'm a proud Clevelander, and I know the city has gone through some rough times, but it's done a massive turnaround. So I'm glad to say that I'm from there and glad to be from there.
There's some great stuff going on downtown along the waterfront, and some great clubs to see concerts at. I used to go to Cleveland for concerts all the time.
Yeah, and also downtown on Public Square, the Soldiers and Sailors Monument is a really interesting place to go for people who might be local. If you haven't gone, go. You can go inside. The names of the men who served from Cuyahoga County are on the walls. And it's also one of the few monuments that depict African American troops in battle on one of the faces. So it's a really interesting sight to see.
So what got a young woman from the Cleveland area interested in the Civil War to begin with?
It's a great question. And the answer is kind of twofold. So one dynamic was my parents, and they actually started my brother and I like on colonial history. So when we were younger, we would go to Colonial Williamsburg just about every year and visited it so much to the extent that the interpreter who played Thomas Jefferson started to recognize us. So there was that. But what got me interested in the Civil War specifically, and I know this sounds interesting to the ear of some Civil War historians, was when I was in 8th grade, we had a descendant of President McKinley come and talk to the classes about not him as president, but his Civil War service, which I know the record might be a little bit subject to scrutiny, to say the least. But anyway, he was very interested in the Battle of Gettysburg. And so when I was, 13 years old in 8th grade, after I heard him speak about Gettysburg, Antietam, I was just hooked on the Civil War. And so that's really what sparked the interest in it. And I have to admit, being that young, I wanted to make a career out of it, but you're not really sure how to do that. So my dad said, well, you have to be a history professor and teach. And I was kind of like, okay, but I really would just like to read and write books. So, but as it all worked out, that's really the only thing I ever wanted to do since I was that young.
And you do get to read and write books, so I guess that's working.
I do, yeah. So there's that.
So Gettysburg, of course, it has done a lot to capture people's imaginations. You know, so many people will trace their Civil War roots to Gettysburg and an experience they had. Did you have a particular spot there, or a particular story that hooked you, or is it just the grand landscape of the place?
It was just the grand landscape of it, really. And then actually going to the sites, and I mean, I would read, and I still do this whenever we go to battlefields, I read like every monument in detail. So, I mean, it was really that battle that hooked me. But then as I went on through my undergraduate studies, which was at the College of Worcester, and then into my master's thesis at the University of Akron, I became more interested in lesser known aspects of the Civil War. So at Worcester, there's a junior senior thesis program, and I did my senior thesis on the Battle of Pickett's Mill, which was part of Sherman's Atlanta campaign, and that he totally omitted from his memoirs. So I did a study of historical memory on that engagement. And then when I was doing my master's, looking for a topic, I visited Camp Chase, or what's left of it now. It's only, there's nothing left of the prison in Columbus, but the cemetery is there. And I decided to write my master's thesis and then my dissertation, which I did at the University of Florida, on POWs and imprisonment generally in the 19th century. Since there's, I mean, still just with all the volumes that are written on the war, that's such an understudied side of it.
And such a contentious
Mm-hmm.
side of it at the time too. I want to dive into that in just a few minutes, but so I'm really interested when you talk about reading all the monuments, doing this memory study of Sherman. You seem to kind of get into that whole space between history and memory, and how they're kind of telling different but parallel stories. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, what I wanted to do with that particular project was look at the soldiers' experience, particularly the Union soldiers' experience of that battle, because I mean, Sherman's army was a group that had an immense amount of respect for him. And that was a pretty lopsided Union defeat. And the soldiers in their writings, as they progressed throughout time, were really pretty upset that Sherman decided to brush it aside. So he didn't say much about it at all in his official report. It was kind of lumped in with the other actions that were on the Dallas line, but it was something that they really thought was a betrayal. And after the war, several of the veterans decided to write about it and recount their stories about it as a way to validate that sacrifice and the sacrifice of those that they lost on that day.
Now, do you blame Sherman for skipping over it?
You know, that's a tricky question. I mean, I think he could have paid more attention to it for sure. But in the context of the Atlanta campaign, I mean, I don't know really how much you need to go into detail about it. I mean, there's more to be said for his memoirs, because he's writing his memoirs in the post-war period when he's Secretary of War, and he's kind of, a scrutinized figure because of what's going on out west with Native Americans. So I think the general feeling of soldiers who fought at that engagement was he was basically leaving it out at that point to save face. But, at the time, it's just the consistency of that campaign and the way that it turned out. And of course, he continues to press towards Atlanta. So, I mean, I don't know.
Yeah,
I guess
yeah.
I could see both sides of it.
And I should probably apologize, because blame is sort of a harsh word there, which I don't mean to put you on the spot. I've been reading a lot of Sherman's memoirs lately on some Vicksburg stuff, and I find that he does the same thing where, like, he'll kind of skip over things that are less flattering and talk a little bit more
Yep.
about. But that seems like a very human sort of thing to
Yeah.
do. But it does make him a rather unreliable narrator
Mhm.
in a lot of respects too. So I
Mhm.
mean, that's been my experience with him lately. So
Yeah, for sure.
now, someone who fell in love with Gettysburg, and you and the McKinley connection you mentioned a second ago, but being in the Cleveland suburbs, you've got James Garfield down the street too. Did he resonate with you at all, or is he like, he's from the West, he wasn't at Gettysburg?
No, I mean, actually, I'm one of the historians that believes that the Western theater was in many ways, what's the right word I want to use, more significant than the East.
I say the war was won in the West.
Yeah. And I mean, you can really see, especially when I'm teaching my Civil War class, I mean, do you see strategy in the East? Sure. But if you really look at the way Grant systematically campaigns for Forts Henry and Donelson and then proceeds down to Vicksburg and how he wins the Vicksburg campaign, that's a much better method of instructing students in how military strategy worked. And I think the turning point of the war is not Gettysburg. The turning point in the war is making Grant general in chief, and then him working very closely with Sherman on two simultaneous campaigns to push for first Atlanta and then up the coast, and ultimately both for Richmond, which is the ultimate objective. So that's kind of how I see it. So I agree, the war is won in the West. Totally agree.
Now, you mentioned Grant getting promoted as sort of the turning point. I've always sort of pinned it at the Wilderness only because Grant gets the power to institute this grand strategy, but it's not until the Wilderness where that plan actually comes into contact with the enemy and he
Yeah.
sticks to it. And then it's like, aha, so this is
Yep.
really,
Yep.
but thinking along the same lines for sure. So then Garfield, yeah, I'll come back to him though, because he's a fascinating character. He's from your backyard.
I know.
Doesn't get a whole lot of attention though, because he had such a short presidency, and people
Yeah.
are really have mixed feelings about his role at Chickamauga. Did you develop any sort of relationship with Garfield as a figure?
No, I mean, honestly, the most I talk about him is when I'm teaching my survey course, but it's in the context of his assassination and then that inspiring the Civil Service Act. But I never forged a connection, you know, with him as far as any kind of scholarly inquiry goes. And maybe I should have, but I was distracted by the prisons, and then I got I'm all about the understudied aspects, I guess. Um, I was always interested in occupation. And so after I was done writing the first body of scholarship that I've published on prisons, I started working on a study of Key West under Union occupation.
Mhm.
So
How-
that's a great way to add some contingency, I think, because I mean, it was such an important point. It's arguably the most important point in the nation, honestly, commercially, because of its position on the Florida Straits. And it's key not only to the federal blockade, but it's also key to communicating that the United States has possession of this coastline to European powers who are in the Western Hemisphere.
Mhm.
So I've really kind of enjoyed that. I've really been enjoying that project a lot.
Now you spent some time in your career down in Florida. Is that kind of what opened your eyes to this, or what got you hooked on this idea of Key West? And
Yeah, it really did. I taught community college for 7 years before I came to UNCW. And of course, we had kind of the task of connecting with the community. And so I started looking into what was going on in Tampa Bay during the Civil War, which is an interesting story because one, if you think about Tampa Bay now, totally different than what it was in 1860. Like the population was about 300. You had some really wealthy landowners like Mr. Gamble, who owned a plantation like around Sarasota County, owned about 5,000 acres and was harvesting pretty much sugar. But then, when the Civil War breaks out, the people who live in Tampa are pretty much opportunists. So if there's federal blockading ships off the coast, they're like, all right, we're unionists today. And if there aren't, some of them are going to be driving cattle towards Georgia for the Confederacy to supply beef after Texas gets cut off. So it's a really interesting place to look at, although the population is sparse. And it's really still frontier. But there's still there's an island. If you go to Fort DeSoto State Park in Florida at the mouth of Tampa Bay, there's an island off of it called Egmont Key. And there was a lighthouse on there, which Confederate sympathizers blacked out. And then when the Union blockade was patrolling that part of the coast, which would have been part of the East Gulf blockading squadron, they made that island into a place for refugees. So there might have been Unionists, there were some former slaves, there were some contrabands, as they would have been called. So I started there, and then when I was looking at the campaigns going up and down the West Coast, of course, all the orders are coming out of Key West. So there's essentially a command center there. It's the headquarters of the East Gulf Blockading Squadron. And so I thought this would be a really interesting place to examine occupation, because it's held by the federal government consistently.
Mm-hmm.
So the regular Army soldiers that are there, it's the 1st U.S. Artillery under the command of Captain John Brannan, and then Captain Edwin Hunt, or Edward Hunt, was chief of engineers working on the construction of Fort Taylor. And as secession is going on, Florida Secession Convention is happening, and Brannan's desperately awaiting some order from Washington to either tell him, keep the fort or not.
Yeah.
So he decides, I'm here, and he and Hunt work together to essentially make sure that the fort and the island don't fall into Confederate hands.
And that story, it just sort of brings to mind for me, kind of one of those aspects of the war that we tend to forget about. Like, the Union had all these positions that it had to fortify and occupy through, and they had the manpower to somehow do it over the course of the war, which, if you think about it, is mind-boggling.
Yes.
That they had that kind of manpower.
Yes. And it's interesting too, because there's so many themes that looking at Key West can illustrate about the war. And one of them is the relationship or the interplay between the regular Army and the volunteers. So the first, occupation, even in and of itself, might be a questionable term, because quite frankly, the entire island of Key West owes its life to the federal government. Like, there's the naval station there, there's a coaling station there, there's a customs house there, there's U.S. District Court there. So it has federal government written all over it. And the civilians, quite frankly, are used to artillerists being there. All of a sudden, after Florida secedes, if you are a Confederate sympathizer, now you're under occupation, right? So the regular artillerists and the engineers are there through 61. And then the other way that Key West is really interesting to talk about is there's, of course, in scholarship on occupation, there's the general notion that the soldiers didn't want to be there. Like, they didn't want to do that duty. That was something that they thought was, not an opportunity to prove themselves on the battlefield, whatever. Most occupation troops get that role after a campaign. Key West does not. And there's actual units like the 47th Pennsylvania, the 90th and 91st New York that get mustered. They go there first.
Oh, okay.
So they have no basis of like what being in battle is like. And they fully consider that, given the commercial and strategic importance of the island, that this is truly part of the war. So of course, there's some of them that are like, I don't want to be here, I'd rather be fighting. But then once they do, like, they get sent to South Carolina in 62 and they experience battle at Pocatello, and then they go back. Brannan orders them back, and they're like, oh gosh, thank you. Like, this is good. They're saving a lot of lives by sending us here. So it's a really interesting, it's an interesting place to talk about.
And if they only knew, people would pay thousands and thousands of dollars to voluntarily go to Key West once upon a time. So I get the free trip, right?
It's so different. In the reactions, it's so interesting to read the reactions of the men, because these guys are coming from Pennsylvania and New York, and most of them get to Key West in February, and they're like, okay, if this is February, maybe I'm not really so excited about experiencing the weather come July.
Yeah. In my wool uniform.
Yeah.
You had the chance elsewhere in your career to take a closer look at occupation, because you spent some time in Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania, and of course Fredericksburg was occupied for much of the war. Did that give you the chance to understand this idea of occupation in a different sort of way than what you've looked at with Key West?
I think it sparked my interest in it. But when I was there, and I'm sorry for an interruption by the cat named General Meade here.
Okay, well, so now I've got to go back to the cats, because you mentioned this before we started, and you have several, and they all have Civil War themed names. Can you? This will be like asking you to name the Seven Dwarfs, but can you like name?
Yes, we have Sherman and Grant, and then we have Meade, And then we have two that are from the Key West project. One is Taylor, named after the fort, and the last one is Brannon,
Oh,
who
very
I found
good.
just to be a really interesting figure in and of himself. So, but yeah, to get back to the Fredericksburg question, when I was working at the battlefield and I was there for the summer in 2005, I was really mostly focused on combat because that was mostly my role. So I knew that there was occupation, but I never really honestly got a chance to delve too far into it by the time that the summer was done. But after that experience, it really did pique my interest and I kind of made a pledge with myself, I guess, for lack of a better word, that sometime in the course of my career, I'm going to study a town that was under occupation. And it just happened to be Key West because that's kind of what I started looking at when I was in Florida. And I thought this would it would be a great case study. And the other thing about it too that's really interesting is it's in Union possession, but the Emancipation Proclamation applies there.
Right.
So it adds just another dynamic to it that, I mean, people are aware, the slaveholders are aware at Key West that, this isn't applying to other places that are controlled by the Union. And so that is cause for a lot of debate.
Mm, okay. Okay. So, well, and it's funny because you said like you didn't have the chance to get into occupation stuff while you're here, and I totally that resonated with me because like by August you're finally like, oh wait, I finally have my walking tour ready, and then it's
Yes.
time to be done for this summer.
Yes.
Like you spend all the time.
Yeah, I was digging into like what's going on the battlefield in Fredericksburg, and then what could I add to the talk that I gave at the Jackson Shrine?
Okay.
So that was
Were those your two primary spots, the shrine and okay, oh, very good.
yeah.
Okay. Excellent. So I'm going to flash back to Columbus because as we were tracing the arc of your career, that's sort of where we left off and got off on a couple tangents here. And you talked about being interested in the prison camp that you discovered there and walking the cemetery and recount for me if you can, just like what was it like to kind of first come in contact with the remains of that prison and walk among those graves and how did that speak to you?
It really indicated to me what is apparent in scholarship, and that this is a site that's overlooked. I mean, of course, like Camp Chase itself served multiple functions throughout the war, but there's nothing left of the prison, right? And I mean, is that justified or not? I mean, that's really kind of beside the point. There aren't too many sites that you can visit where you can actually see a Civil War prison. It's usually like, here's the cemetery. So I guess kind of coming off at that point, I'm coming off the Pickett's Mill project. And I was kind of thinking, you know, how do these guys feel about being left out? So there was kind of a question of memory there, but really where I took the study at that point for the master's thesis was how the prison itself was kind of an integral part of the Northern home front. Like, what's the interplay between prisoners and civilians? How are they remembered? How are they regarded? How did civil authority impact the operation of the military prisons? And that's really the question then that I took and ran with for my dissertation. Because I mean, we think of now the federal government in prisons as being synonymous, and really the Civil War is the first time that the federal government has any large scale experience with any kind of incarceration, since there was only one federal penitentiary before the war.
Which they had to then make up as they went along because they didn't have that
Yep.
experience.
Yep.
So what was it like to study that learning curve? Because I'm sure along the way there must have been some horrific bumps.
Yeah, I mean, the topic of imprisonment is just, that was some really hard reading.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, especially when the prisoners, generally speaking, when they're writing their diaries, they fall into two camps. You either have the guys that are, they remain optimistic, they're hopeful, and then unfortunately, like the general pattern that I found with those people was that they ended up dying in prison. And you have the people who were just totally forlorn, and there wasn't anything that anybody could do to lift their spirits. So reading what they have to say is is really interesting. In their diaries, their letters are a different story because everything was censored.
Mm.
So they're limited to a page. And I mean, prison rules, you can see it posted at every prison. You can find these in the archives. They could only write on certain topics. So they could write on home, they could write on well-being. They couldn't write on anything else if they wanted to have a chance of getting their letter out. And the prisoners then were very concerned about communicating to their loved ones at home that, hey, if you don't write on these things, your letter's not getting in.
Yeah.
So there's like this obsessive, almost in some correspondence from the prisoners to their wives or parents or whatever, that do you know the rules? Because I need to hear from you, even if it's whitewashed. Like, I need to hear from you, and to hear from you, this is what you have to do.
Wow. And you talk about that in the subtitle of your book talks about, you know, crisis. You frame it in a strong way. Tell me about that framing, because I thought that was a pretty fascinating and an illuminating way to frame the discussion.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of in line with how I teach the war generally. I mean, a lot of it goes back to the federal government, and the federal government was not powerful at all in the 19th century, right? I think there were literally 17 federal laws
Yeah.
on the books, and they applied to DC, they applied to the forts, they applied to, you know, the Western territories. That's it. So the federal government didn't have a framework really for dealing with prisoners of war, nor did they anticipate, nor did anybody except like Sherman, back to Sherman, right, think that the war was going to be long. So they have a couple of models. I mean, of course, they have the wars, the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, not really the Mexican War. That's not a total basis that they're using. They use some cues from that. But in my mind, kind of the most significant dynamic that informed how military prisons were run was a state penitentiary system, which was developed. It's developed from military law. Elam Lins, who came up with the Pennsylvania system, I'm sorry, the Auburn system of its solitary confinement at night and labor during the day. He was a War of 1812 veteran. And so he took a lot of dynamics of military punishment and put them into the penitentiary punishment program. So some of the underlying principles of penitentiaries, various rules, punishments, orders, even down to military labor, get replicated in military prisons. But when the war breaks out, there's kind of a divide, and this is both North and South, right? Between like who's in charge here. Because as far as the state authorities are concerned, they believe that that's something that they have historically dealt with. Doesn't matter what kind of institution it is, we're controlling it. And that's very pronounced in Ohio. Ohio's Governor David Todd, who's governor during the early part of the war, is fully convinced that he should have full say over what goes on at Camp Chase. He doesn't want the federal officials involved at all. And there's similar kind of authority questions, like in North Carolina, when Salisbury is established, the governor, state governor, appoints Braxton Craven as commandant, and he doesn't know who to report to. It's like, do I report? In North Carolina did not establish a penitentiary. It's one of 3 states that didn't. But he doesn't know, like, who am I reporting to the governor? Am I reporting to the Secretary of War? Like, he really has no idea what to do. So there's no, like, we tend to think in terms of, you know, government agencies, I guess, for lack of a better word, or institutions being systemic. There's no system.
Wow.
Right? So there's a lot of disciplinary cues that once the United States government does start to have a little bit more influence over the prisons with the Commissary General of Prisoners, they're taking cues from the state authorities. And then the prisoners themselves are POWs. So, you know, if you go to the Lieber Code or even, you know, laws of war that predated it, POW is not a criminal, but there's such a strong association in the 19th century with imprisonment equating criminal that POWs refer to themselves very, very frequently as felons.
Wow.
So they adopt that stigma, and it's very hard for them. Like, some of them won't even write home because they don't want their families to know that they're incarcerated. So and I guess when I'm talking about crisis, on one level, is it numbers? Sure. but it's also really, I mean, if you think about kind of a psychological crisis for the prisoners themselves, they think, I mean, these are people who, absent the Civil War, would have probably not had any experience with the military, nor would they, I mean, hopefully, had any experience with imprisonment. And instead, they're getting both. And so they have to kind of adjust to how they relate to themselves and how they relate to their families.
And this sense of confusion and it remains unresolved after the war
Yeah.
and sort of the way people are treated. Talk a little bit about that because I know that was such a contentious area when other veterans are trying to come together.
Mhm.
Uh, Incarcerated veterans weren't buying into that.
No, they have a really hard time. I mean, there is kind of a parallel between them and Sherman's men at Pickett's Mill, as in we have been forgotten, right? So there's that comes across frequently in their post-war writings. But then there's also, on the flip side, of course, this is one of the most contentious issues during the war, although, you know, in scholarship, it hasn't gotten that much attention, like I said, but the United States Congress authorizes a congressional investigation in 1867. And so it will invite Union veterans to come forward and talk about their treatment in Southern prisons. So on one level, they feel like they're sidelined. And on another level, they're invited to speak. And of course, what these POWs say has grains of truth to it, but it can also lead to some embellishment given I mean, this is inspired by atrocities at places like Andersonville,
Mhm.
right? So if a soldier is going to embellish something, that's also the place that they might do it. Which is why, I mean, I think really, I mean, we in 2024, you know, think that the punishments that were meted out in the 19th century, whether it's in the military or it's in the prisons, are brutal. They're inhumane. They were standard practice at the time. You know, I mean, that's kind of the, you know, if you're hanging by your thumbs, is that comfortable? No, but that's what the punishment was. If you're on a bread and water diet and you're bucked and gagged, that's what the punishment was. You know, if you're hanged in the courtyard, that's what the punishment was. So it's that kind of context of how punishment operated in the 19th century that I think oftentimes with a modern lens, people look at it and think, well, that's excessive. When in reality, that was unfortunately standard operating procedure.
Yeah, yeah. And you mentioned context too, and I think about the context that some of this testimony was given in, where you've got radical Republicans who are interested in retribution, and so this is a way to kind of ratchet up the temperature on some of that stuff, and so I mean, there's just some really interesting context to all of that as they're trying to kind of move past this incarceration story
Yeah.
that they can't move past.
Right. Yeah. And both, I mean, veterans on both sides will write about it in their various publications. And of course, you have, you know, when I was doing the research for the book, it was always, you know, take the memoirs with more of a grain of salt. Because of course there's memory issues and whatnot. Do they have truth in them? Absolutely. But there's also, like, you have to consider, like we were talking about with Sherman's memoirs, when's he writing it? What's going on? What's going on in the nation? You know?
Yeah. A lot of people don't realize there are actually volumes of the OR that are dedicated to the
Huh?
prison. When you talk about the lack of systems, and boy, you can really see
Yes.
through those OR volumes.
Yeah, it's really, I mean, there's a little bit more organization um in the North because William Hoffman becomes Commissary General of Prisoners in 1862. But I really don't know. I mean, anytime people talk about that in a systemic way, it's like, well, what would the system look like? What does that mean? Is it supply? Is it shifting prisoners? Which they did. I mean, prison gets too crowded, you're going to shift them somewhere else, new facilities get established, whatever. But what does that actually mean? And what is one guy in charge? Ultimately, I mean, if you think about it, what's he going to be able to solve in an instance where so many individuals are incarcerated?
Right. Right. Yeah, and if you don't even know who you're reporting to, like who's sending me my supplies, that's
Yes. Yep.
those are issues, right? So before I forget, the title of your book, because I want to make sure folks get a chance to hear that. And I've
Sure. It's the first book was Penitentiaries, Punishment in Military Prisons, Familiar Responses to an Extraordinary Crisis during the American Civil War. And I will say the titles are not my strong suit.
I was gonna say that's the part I knew I would not be able to get out. So and then your upcoming book on Florida.
That is Stronghold of the Union, Key West under martial law.
Okay. And when do we get to see that one?
I believe I'm going through revisions of the full draft.
Okay.
So my goal is to have that back to the press. It's going to be published by the University Press of Florida.
Oh,
So
cool.
I'm hoping to have that back to the press by the end of the summer. But I
All right.
will say that, when I came into this, the first book was topical,
Yeah.
and I'm doing a chronological narrative. Like, of course, there's an argument written to it. I thought this will certainly be easier. Oh, no, no. Like, how many rabbit holes can we go down? And the narrative will so do that. So it's taken longer than I really wanted, but I really want to make it. I want to make it good. I want to make it a story that people are gonna read and hopefully think about. I mean, of course, when you think about Key West now, you think about Jimmy Buffett, which is totally acceptable,
Yeah.
and you think about like the beach, right? But there's so much history in Key West. I did a couple episodes of the Florida History Podcast recently, and the host Carter Krishna asked me, what can people go to see on the island? And there's so much Civil War history, there's so much military history there, and it's just a story that's waiting to be told and is told. It's just, are people going there to look for it? If you are, you'll find plenty.
Yeah. When I went to Key West, they have that plaza where there are the busts of famous people associated
Yes.
with West. And it was kind of neat to walk through there because it's like, oh wait, I didn't know this person had this.
Yeah.
I didn't know that person had, and so it was kind of a neat way to be introduced to all this history that you're talking about. I mean, I knew Hemingway and Truman,
Yeah.
and to see all these other people, it's like, wow, this is pretty fascinating.
Yeah.
So, what made you make the jump to go to get your PhD?
It was, I guess, wanting to be a history professor. It was a necessity, but I actually had a moment where I worked at Fredericksburg for one summer, and then the following summer, I worked for Cuyahoga Valley National Park, which is between Cleveland and Akron on the old Ohio and Erie Canal, and I did basically canal lock demonstrations all summer and talked about canal history. So another one of the things that I get really excited about when I teach is canals, and my students are kind of like, okay, that's
That's a
neat.
beautiful park. It's totally underrated park.
It is, and it's actually one of the most visited in the national park system because of the fact that it's essentially in an urban environment. So it's got the history, it's got the hiking, it's got, if you're a birder, you like waterfalls, like you can find all of that there. But when I was getting ready to move to Florida, my boss at Cuyahoga Valley was like, "Are you sure you don't want to just work full time for the Park Service?" And I was like, "Oh, tempting. Now I must think." But then I said, "No, if I don't, I had the offer from Florida, I had the deal to go there, and I thought this was something that I wanted to do, and if I don't do it, then I'm going to regret it." So I did have like the fleeting possibility of working for the Park Service, which it was just really truly an honor to be able to do that.
Yeah. But going back to your childhood dream of reading and writing books, probably
Yeah.
not going to do that on the canal, right?
No.
So you went to Florida, and how long did it take you to get through your PhD program?
I started in 2006 and I finished in 2012. And the last 2 years, I taught high school for a year, and then I got the job at St. Petersburg College and started teaching community college while I was finishing.
Okay. And now you're at UNC Wilmington. And let me ask you, because I have taught at a 4-year college with a high percentage of non-traditional students, and then a more traditional,
Yes.
undergraduate program where it's just a lot of traditional students from school. And the student bodies are really different when you've got a lot of non-traditional students. What's your experience been like teaching history to those two different types of audiences?
I loved having non-traditional students in the community college classroom. Like that is for a teacher, a setting like none other, really, because you have like most community colleges do, but St. Petersburg College had a really strong early college program. So I had a whole bunch of high school kids. I had kind of traditional age college students. I had people who were going back for second careers, a lot of veterans. And then I had a lot of senior citizens. My oldest student was 92,
Wow.
and she just wanted to, she audited, she didn't take anything for credit, but she took every single class that I taught. And it was really fun having her in class, not just for me, but for the students, because like she grew up in New York City. So when we got to the Great Depression, I was just like, Rosalia, tell them what it was like. Like you can do it better than I can. And I mean, the students learned so much, and I think they learned more how to interact with each other and to interact with people of different age groups. Because of course, when, high schoolers tended to be a little bit shy, but I loved that dynamic because, I mean, you have just the range of ages, the range of experiences. So I don't get that much at UNCW. It's definitely more of strictly college age. Every now and then I'll get somebody who audits, which I love having those students in, but it's definitely a different dynamic in the classroom, right? I do miss the diversity that was apparent in the community college setting.
And I always found it really neat because, a non-traditional student, they're usually paying for it out of their own pocket. They know why they're there. They've got
Yep.
goals, and so
Yep.
they're super motivated to do well, which I think lifts up the whole class,
Yes.
which is nice. So
Yes.
now that you're in Wilmington, which of course has its own huge Civil War and post-Civil War history, that's got to be, kind of like having your own little playground in the backyard. Tell me what it's been like to land there.
I need to, and it's on my agenda, as far as research goes, to look more into the local history of Wilmington during the war. Of course, Chris Vonville has covered the military side of that, but I'm really interested in, once I finish the Key West project, I do plan to write a history of imprisonment at Fort Jefferson. I have a lot of that research done, given that its records and the records for Key West were in the same location in the National Archive. So I just kind of yanked a lot of it. There's still some stuff that I have to do. But after that project is done, I want to dig into kind of what civilian life was like in Wilmington during the war. And there are so many great resources for that. Not just archives, but of course the historic houses and different battle sites. So that will be something that I do. Most of what I've been talking about in the classroom, as far as Wilmington is concerned, is the 1898 coup.
Mhm.
There's been a really big push at UNCW to get more of that narrative into the curriculum because it has been misinterpreted and, quite frankly, just erased
Right.
for so much time. So I think that's a really positive thing that's going on at the university.
One of my favorite writers, he was a creative nonfiction writer named Philip Gerard, and he was on the
Yes.
faculty there. And he had passed away, but he was just about to start writing a narrative history of that. And I was so disappointed, that he never got to finish that before he left. For folks who are unfamiliar with that coup, can you give us just a quick little synopsis?
Yeah, it's oh gosh, let me see if I can distill it.
I know, because there's a lot that goes on, right?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack, but if I had to boil it down, um, we can talk about it really as a Reconstruction story. In Reconstruction, you think about, the conventional timing is 1865 to 1877. But in Wilmington, you could say, like, if the goal for Reconstruction is new opportunities for Blacks, right? They're apparent in Wilmington in several ways. So Wilmington was unique because, okay, we're in the United States, democracy, democratic republic, majority rules. There's a significant Black population in Wilmington. And so what they're able to do in the 1890s is the local government was part of a political movement called Fusion, which basically melded the Republican Party with the Populist Party. Wilmington in the city had a biracial government in 1898. It also had a thriving Black community. So when that election came up in 1898 at the state level and also at the local level, there was a white supremacy campaign. And a lot of the controversy in Wilmington was sparked by Rebecca Felton, who was she's a female activist from Georgia, but she was writing about basically what's known as the rape myth, but validating it, and that, Black men are a danger to white women. And if that dynamic is going to go on, then lynchings should occur. That's pretty much a summary of what she had written in one of the newspapers. The response to that by Alexander Manley, who was the editor of a Black newspaper in Wilmington, was, if there are these relationships that are going on, white women are willfully choosing to be with Black men. And so that kind of tipped off a lot of ire in the white community. And when the election came about in November, there were some seats on the Board of Aldermen, the mayor, that were not up for re-election. There were some that were. So white supremacists that were led by, among others, Confederate veteran Alfred Moore Waddell, decided that they wanted to run Manley out of town and then show up at the courthouse with weapons and get those individuals who constituted that biracial fusion coalition to resign. And there are, the estimates of casualties range in number. So they could be as low as 60, they could be as high as 300. But that's considered to be the only successful overthrow of a democratically elected government in United States history. And it really decimated the Black population of Wilmington. A lot of people fled and didn't come back. And so that community was basically run out of town or murdered.
Yeah. Literally an armed insurrection that overthrew the local government. Crazy stuff. So before we wrap up, Angela, let me hit you with a quick lightning round here of questions. All right. So, favorite Civil War site?
Guess I have to say Andersonville.
Oh, okay. All right. Very good. Very good.
That's a strange kind of answer, I guess.
No. I mean, particularly since you're right about prisons, but I mean, having walked there myself, it's just like it's a haunting landscape. It's yeah. So, a Civil War book you would recommend to somebody?
That's a good question.
And there are a lot, but
I know, and I'm stuck in this. I'm stuck in the process of just reading so much about Florida history and Key West. But I have to say, if I had to go with classics, I would still say it's James McPherson's Battle Cry of Freedom.
Yep. Hard to go wrong with that one. So what are you reading right now?
I am reading a book on occupation of Knoxville, Tennessee.
Oh, okay.
So I'm trying to my theory is that there are a lot of actions at Key West that predated tactics taken in occupation elsewhere. Okay. So I'm trying to work on that chronology. So I'm reading that book to run that out.
I've actually spent a lot of time with Knoxville in the last year because Ed Lowe just had a book in our Emerging Civil War series about Longstreet's East Tennessee campaign. So I've been doing a lot of reading to help him through with that book. So I empathize, sympathize.
And it seems like the project will just take your brain and suck all of the other knowledge that you might have out of it.
But like that goes back to your comment a few minutes ago about rabbit holes, though, and like to me that's so exciting to hear you talk about it because it means you're excited,
yes,
and so you're anxious to go down those rabbit holes, yes. Because if you didn't care, you'd be like, I'll look that up.
So, and there's so many people that annoy the Union soldiers at Key West that I have to figure out who they were and why they're doing it.
And finally, in the spirit of our Women's History Month theme, any advice that you would offer to a young woman who's thinking about getting into Civil War history as a career?
Wow. I guess keep in mind that the profession is changing. And what I mean by that is even when I started graduate school, still, I think the field was heavily dominated by men. To the extent that when I went to do my master's, I specifically went to the University of Akron so I could work with Leslie Gordon, because she was one of the few female Civil War historians at the time. But the field itself is changing. And so now there's a much more significant presence of women in the scholarly ranks. It's different when you go out to the public.
Mhm.
So the public will still largely think, like, when they think of a Civil War historian, they think of, quite frankly, a white man.
Mhm.
And I have actually been told by people who I've just met that I don't look like a Civil War historian. So, so whatever that means. But it's just kind of, you have to be aware of that. And if if you have a passion for the subject and you are informed and you can speak about it in ways that are intellectual, but also that can connect with the public, it's a great way to kind of change that assumption that Civil War historians are men, right? But because that's been something that, has followed me my entire life. Like, here I was at, 13, and I'm like interested in this battle. And it's not, generally speaking, something that young women are all that interested in. But if you've got a passion, just keep going for it. That's what I'd say. But with the recognition that you will encounter some, I guess, pushback, for lack of a better phrase.
Okay. Okay. But if your goal is to grow up and read and write books, then
And then you have to deal with it.
well, I've got to say, of course, I've never sat in one of your classes, but this has been an enlivening conversation. So your students have got to be lucky to have you. This is just such a privilege to have you on the program today.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed it, Chris.
Oh, wonderful. Thanks so much, Angie. Thanks for being with us today. So
You're welcome.
I'm Chris Mikowski for Angie Zombeck here on the Emerging Civil War podcast. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.